We knew that there were some outcomes that the data was too sparse or too varied. And one example was the ADHD I used earlier. We just don't have enough data to support its use in this report. And I went over and over and over that particular one because I felt like the diagnosis of ADHD and the treatment of ADHD was such an important part of this, and I just could not justify its use. None of us could. So despite our best efforts, we couldn't get some of those things included. Those are areas for future research. For all of us here that are kind of, looking at kind of doing research projects and kind of thinking about what to do next, for the students as you work on your PhDs, you can find several kind of topics here, do you think of kind of working towards this? So one of the major issue might be is how do we get this into the political stream, into the political consciousness of people? And how do we get people to kind of focus on this, right? One of the difficulties sometimes is, I think, is that some media in particular do a really good job of shooting the messenger, right? There's no thoughtful discussion about what is this study. Let's shoot it full of holes, but let's thoughtfully shoot it full of holes. And I'm fine with the thoughtful conversation, as I said. I have very little kind of, I actually will hear students say at times, I heard this on TV, and I'm troubled by that, or he told me, and I trust everything he says. Trust but always verify. So one of the things, I think, there's a dual thing here, for me at least, about where to go with this, and they're both kind of big vision things. One of them is how do we educate each other and ourselves about being thoughtful consumers of research, especially at the policy level, right? Which is, when I talk about research methods, when I talk about literature review, when I talk about all that kind of stuff, how do we do that stuff, right? We all have to write papers in college, for example. You're actually, I would argue, doing a literature review, in many ways. You have to make statements and support those statements and everything else. And how do you evaluate the quality of a research study? Right? That's a really good question. What we hope is that the literature process and the scientific process includes things like peer review. It includes ethics. It includes all these kind of things that help to make sure that the literature, the research that you do read is pretty good. But the other part about this is that we also need to remember is that this study should be taken within the context of other studies. I'm often troubled by reading the paper, a study just showed that, if you walk outside in the rain, you get wet, or something like that. It's like, yeah, I know that, but maybe that's a bad example or something. It was the run versus walk. Do you get less wet if you run versus if you walk? Someone did a study on that a few years ago. I thought it was really interesting. But the results of that study, the findings of that study, are not necessarily fact. It's not necessarily horrendously useful. And that's why the notion of literature review is so key. This study, taken within the context of other studies, is what becomes useful. And I think the purpose of education in the end is how do we use information, and how do we pull information together in a useful way, and how do we frame that education for policymakers. I'm on a huge soapbox right now, and I know that, so I apologize. But how do we, in such a way that we can frame this for people so they hear it, and so that they understand it. And that's the hard part about this. So when we say, what do we do with these data in this study, I think that what we're trying to do is, we had a release at the National Press Club in June or something like that. So we got some folks there from the media, not as many as we had hoped. Something else happened that day, and of course everyone ran across town, so we didn't get the attention we had hoped for. Continuing to put this out there, there's the website for Sodexo has this on there, helpstophunger.org, so the full report is on there, So we hope to continue to send this report to people. Our capacity, all of us here, our capacity to frame the issue by reviewing the other literature, putting it together in a package, and getting it out there. And we hear about this a lot, but there's actually research that's kind of helping us to understand this notion of issue framing. For example, we know that telling kids that that just saying no for drugs or don't smoke otherwise you're going to get black lung doesn't work for kids, right? We should know that based on what we understand about child development, but we know that doesn't work. So that framing of that issue is off. How do we reframe that issue to get that message across? It's an example of issue framing. But there are a couple of researchers out there doing that. One guy is out at UCLA, I think, and it's phenomenal.